Hello and welcome to Frog Flicks, the historical costume movie and TV blog, podcast, and now video. I'm your host, Tristan L. Bass, and I'm here with our original Broadway recording cast of
Sarah Lorraine,
Kendra Van Cleve.
So we're here to talk about costumes on the screen, 16th century style, which is usually Queen Elizabeth, Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and all that good stuff. You might notice we're not wearing, standard issue everyday clothes. So let's talk about it a little bit.
I am wearing a 1560s Venetian outfit, upper class, hence all the bling. Hair is slightly inspired by allegorical portraits because I just look better with a little bit of hair down. And that's it. It has seashells. I call it my mermaid dress.
I'm wearing a 1560s pair of bodies. So really, I just decided I'd show up in my underwear because I feel that underwear is a very important and integral part of a good costume foundation, one that's consistently lacking in movies all the time. So, ta-da! Here's what we wear underneath all those fabulous 1560s gowns. There's a bit of a discrepancy about how people, whether they actually wore bodies like this. It's a little bit of a gray area research-wise, but it gives the right look, and I feel fabulous in it.
And I'm wearing a middling upper class gown that is a front closing fitted gown, very often found in drawings such as English and Dutch women would wear, market women and to upper class. I'm also wearing a attifet or Mary Stuart cap. Actually, a wired coif is another more common word for it, which is just a coif that is hand sewn and has a little bit of wire around the top. Let's start with 3 screen portrayals of the 16th century that we find sorely lacking in the costume department. Probably in other departments too, but we're going to focus on the costumes today. First up is Gunpowder, Treason, and Plot from 2004. This was a BBC production, and often we look to the Beeb for high quality drama with beautiful costumes and stunning history and fine acting, and this ain't it. Costume designer Nick Eady, you pronounce it. I'm sure he does other fine work. This is not an example of it. So the story is focused mostly on Mary Stuart, her interactions with Queen Elizabeth. And then in the second part, it goes to James I of Scotland, the 6th of England. Oh dear. The plot is terrible. The costumes are terrible.
Well, for me, I have to start with the terrible, terrible fit of the dresses. Now, it's quite possible that these were rentals, even on the principals, and I'm talking on Mary, Queen of Scots, but nothing fits well. There's stress wrinkles everywhere. Most things look too small for her. There's one dress in particular that literally, it looks like she's wearing a backpack. I mean, it's not good. It's not good at all. And then if you look at the back, yes, dresses laced or, otherwise when they closed in the back or front, it was to allow for changing of, size, etc. Perfectly reasonable that they don't all close, perfectly. And yet she's the queen and she's the principal of your production. I would think on both counts, she should have stuff that is custom made for her at her current size. And everything is clearly, there's sort of, the lacing kind of does that. And yeah, there's a placket, whatever, anyway. But it's just, nothing looks like it was made for darling Clément's poesy.
My biggest problem with it, in addition to the fit, which is terrible, is the materials. Cheesoid fabrics, like cheap-ass poly-baroque satin, like Casa collection at Joann's, which they don't even have in Britain, so I don't even know where they got this shitty.
They specially imported the Casa collection for this film.
Yeah, really, like at great expense, I'm sure. It's just so cheesy and crappy. Like, did they have no budget? I'm gonna guess they had no budget and no time, and there's like, oh, let's grab this crappy acetate lining fabric, that'll work. Most of it is just, solid colors. But sometimes when they used a brocade or damask, quotes, it's not even remotely period. It's just crap. It's high school theater production level.
And when they go to Anne of Denmark, I think she's in what's supposed to be wools, but it just reads as like polyester suiting. It's not good.
So I have to confess, I've never seen the show, but I have, of course, seen enough of the images. But the dress is, I think, the one that Kendra refers to as the backpack dress. She has these decorative shoulder rolls on her sleeves that are so high up, they're almost like, it just looks like she's wearing the straps of a backpack instead of, offset with larger sleeves to make it proportionally correct for the 1580s, for sure. The other thing that immediately struck me is that one of the sleeves is noticeably at least 2 inches shorter than the other one. I mean, maybe it's pushed up slightly on her arm. I don't know. I'm just saying it's really a weird look. The other part is the actress is very slender, and you can create that 16th century shape really well with that body type. I memean, Queen Elizabeth I had that body type, but this is how you not do that. It's a really good example of just sticking somebody without an hourglass figure into a corset that just turns them into a tube, and then not really being able to proportionally correct the upper body and the shoulders and the lower body in like the skirt and the waistline to give that very distinctive upside down triangular shape of the Elizabethan period specifically. And then the skirt would have been stitched to the bodice in back then, but a lot of times theatrically, it makes more sense to have the bodice and the skirt separate for ease of laundering and storage and whatnot. But you can always hook and eye those suckers together to create the illusion of a single garment. And this one does not. So the waistband is actually visible. The skirt has slipped down. It's actually offset by about good 3 inches or so. So it's not hanging directly in the center. It's just like a hot mess.
One last thing that's terrible about this production, which there's so many, is the hair. Queen Elizabeth has this big frizzy do. And not like the little curls that often happen. No, it's like a triangular frizzy do. Like what? It's very, I don't know, 80s, 1980s, not 1580s. No, it's why? It doesn't make any sense. It's just weird. Okay, next up on our hit parade, really everyone's favorite punching bag. We had 3 or 4 years of this thanks to Showtime. It's called The Tudors. Costume designer was Joan Bergen, who, I really don't have any good things to say about her. She had a lot of work to do. And she did have a distinct design directive to make Henry VIII's court look sexy. And that's what she did. And it wasn't nice. I will start off by saying that the sexy directive, which was straight from the top, the director, producer, everybody was like, we're going to sex up this court. That's my biggest problem with it, is that you get things like Anne Boleyn with bodice cut down to here. You get Henry VIII with, in doublets with no sleeves.
The costume, actually, that I wanted to talk about that has always been like, what the frock for me is Anne of Cleves's presentation at court. She shows up in this wacky outfit that's just like, they were looking at the Holbein portrait and then just kind of threw a bunch of shit together in a vague way that kind of maybe looked a little ish like it. But the weird thing is she's got this ridiculous hat on that resembles nothing at all in history. And it's not a good look. It's got pearls like glued around the base of it. I looked at it and I was like, well, it looks like they took that from Padme's wardrobe in the Star Wars prequels and just slapped a bunch of fake pearls on it and stuck it on her head. And I was like, there you go. You're a wacky princess.
I'm pretty sure there are elephants in the pattern of her dress, which, I mean, Cleves is
well known for its elephants.
But I was just going to say, I mean, yes, it's far away, but it's not on another continent. So I have only watched half of the Tudors, and someday we'll go back and watch the second half just for the lulz. But one of the things I did is I did a post for our blog that was looking at Jane Seymour, everyone's least favorite queen because she's the most boring. So the first actress has this dress that she wears constantly that has this weird crown motif on it that is then like has hot glued jewels on it.
That was Lady in Waiting.
That was a Lady in Waiting uniform. Are you serious?
Yes, I remember that.
Oh my God.
It's a Heat and Bond, like rhinestone crown that you can get at Joann's. I am positive.
Because they all wore them, at least.
It's just like right here. Like,
yes. The thing that annoys me about the costumes in this film is it just feels like there was no effort made. So in one outfit, she's wearing, as a standalone piece, a 1950s vintage collar that's like screams 1950s.
I used to work at a vintage store, and that exact collar would always come through. I saw it on TV. I'm like, what? So stupid.
And then she has this dress, which is so hideous in the multiple reverse colors made up into the same garment, which you never would have done in the period. The puffy princess sleeves, the machine embroidery. Again, it just feels like the least possible amount of effort was made here to cover the actress and not send her off nude. I mean, I feel like somebody kind of flopped over in bed, went, okay, she's ready, and they called it good.
One of the things I remember the costume designer talking about was how they had no budget, none whatsoever. And so she was very much like, I took my favorite leather jacket that I owned and I made it into a doublet for Henry, because she was literally pulling clothes out of her own closet to clothe the cast. And I have kind of a lot of sympathy for her in that regard, that she was not given a lot of money to work with.
So now our third, and maybe the worst, historical costume travesty. Mary, Queen of Scots, 2018. Hear my incoherent screaming. Holy shit. This film is just pop culture trash. Absolute trash. Alexandra Byrne is the costume designer, and she's done some good things, but she's also done some kind of questionably historical things. She did the Elizabeth movies with Cate Blanchett, which are very pretty on historical accuracy. Here, it was all directorial vision. So let's just run down some of the shittiest parts. From the very first, we see Mary, Queen of Scots, in denim, a kicky shrug, hair that is from the 1590s, if we're going to be generous, by which she would have been dead. And then all this crazy, punk ass jewelry with, no, these are all not right. Not right. And then, we're not even getting to things like the man bags. What the fuck?
Yeah, so they literally, instead of giving the men trunk hose, which are the pants that are puffy kind of around the hip and then more fitted, which was very stylish at this time, to make that silhouette, they gave the men saddlebags, literal saddlebags. I don't know what they're carrying around in these saddlebags. I mean, sure, it's handy to have a man bag, but saddlebags are not pants. My biggest issue was near the end, they suddenly start dressing Queen Elizabeth quite well. I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect, but so you're watching about 3/4 of the movie. People are in denim. Hair is a travesty. Just so wrong on multiple levels. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, Queen Elizabeth figures out how to dress. Nobody else does, but Queen Elizabeth does. And she's suddenly wearing these things that are beautiful and sort of impressive and not too far from historical accuracy. And it's like, you had it in you. Why couldn't you have done it from the start? And what does that even tell us about her character? When she's younger, she's just cash, hanging at the mall wearing the denim. And now she's older, so she has to dress up like an actual normal person of her time period. I have no idea what the thought process was, but it upset me.
I was just irritated, well, by everything, but the thing that initially stood out is the red chemise gown that's actually a reuse from Elizabeth, the Golden Age, the same one Samantha Morton wore as Mary Queen of Scots. The scene that you see it in, of course, it's supposed to be referencing that when Mary Queen of Scots was executed, she wore a red kirtle. And so far, I think the only show that really kind of got this is Elizabeth R. In the sense that it was an undergarment that she would have worn over her main gown, so it was fitted and had some structure to it, but it was out of red satin. But in this version of it, costume designer has decided to go with this like weird chemise, 18th century chemise gown, Grecian look, maybe David's bridal bridesmaid outfitty thing.
Victoria's Secret, please.
Okay, so what happens is you see Mary walk in to her execution area, and her ladies in waiting, there's like 4 of them, and they each grab a part of her dress and they just rip it apart. It's like
Magic Mike!
Break away! And then she's got this red thing on that was actually worn by another actress in another film that the costume designer worked on. Like, I just, wow. Okay, no fucks were given in this show. That literally is it.
16th century Velcro, rip!
I know, it's just, her costume just pulls apart and she's like, yeah. It just is weird.
I think we all screamed in the theater.
Yeah, and we got shushed numerous times by the people in the theater who were not happy with our little whispers.
By the way, we actually have a whole podcast about this movie where you can really actually hear the incoherent screaming and also hear us talk about all the plot problems because, this is just a terrible movie. It's a really terrible movie. But this is the tip of the iceberg of all the terrible, terrible things about it. So you may think Hollywood just sucks when it comes to 16th century costume. And, they can. It's true. But it's not all bad. People often ask us, hey, are there any movies or TV shows that get it right? You know what? There are. In fact, if we go back the mists of time to 1971's Elizabeth R., that is the quintessence, the ideal, the best version of 16th century costume, Elizabethan particularly, on screen. Now, yes, because it's filmed in 1970s, the film quality isn't that great. The lighting isn't spectacular. It's on video and it's got shadows and all that. But the actual costumes created are stunning. Elizabeth Waller was the costume designer. She did extensive study of actual portraits of Queen Elizabeth and recreated a stunning number of them for this multi-part miniseries. She actually recreated them. I mean, they look like the portraits to the nth degree in detail. Jean Honeysett was one of the main people in the workshop who built these costumes. And this book by Jean Honeysett goes into detail about how she made many of these costumes, from the corsets to the farthingales to the bodices, how they were patterned, and how she worked on Elizabeth R. These are, theatrical techniques, but based on history, because they would look at, say, how the embroidery fit around the side of a bodice in a portrait. And that's how they learned how to pattern. They would look at how the light fell to see how, a ruff sat. So they really studied and used that information to create these gowns, and it shows on screen. It's mind-blowing work. The actual materials, sometimes like the jewels are plastic, curtain fabric and stuff like that, because it was the BBC. It was TV production in the 70s. They didn't have giant budgets, but they took the care and the time to make things look historical. And it shows.
One of the dresses that is extensively covered out there on the internet and in actually a couple of different books, including Jean Honeysett's book, is the Phoenix gown. And it's also referenced in the back of Patterns of Fashion, 1560 to 1610 or whatever that one is. But it's also, if you go flip to the very back of that particular book, there's an entire write-up, a little essay about how these gowns were created for this series. The Phoenix gown is one of these really interesting gowns. It's the it's based on the portrait of Elizabeth I by Nicholas Hilliard, circa 1575. And it's embroidered all over with these kind of like 3-leaf clover designs in gold on a black velvet. The designers actually recreated the fabric with an embroidery machine and had to go through all sorts of like interesting geometry to get the correct proportions and to make sure that the pattern kind of is on the bias, so it had to be cut all in one piece. It's this whole thing that they kind of discovered on how to make this dress look the way it did. But one of the most interesting little tidbits about it is that they only had like a certain amount of fabric, and they send it off to the embroiderer, and the embroiderer sends back the fabric, and it's been shrunk because the embroidery would eat up enough of the fabric in the process of embroidery, so they ended up with a significantly less amount of fabric. And so they actually had to piece in, I think it was probably about a foot or so of fabric around the bottom of the skirt to make it so they could actually get the dress out of it, and that amount of fabric. And it's just really fabulous. It ends up looking amazing on screen. And I think it's one of the best examples of using a portrait as a reference and really just sticking to it. And they pulled it off.
And this is before computerized embroidery machines. It's a little closer to freehand embroidery on machines. So you look at one motif and think about how long it would take to do all of those motifs on this entire gown.
There is a website of someone who actually extensively studied this dress. They had the dress went on display, and she was able to get up close and study it in person. And it's really interesting. It talks about the embroidery machine that they used. It's very extensive, and it's a really fascinating little bit of kind of theatrical costuming history, I guess.
All right, so the next production we'll talk about that has excellent costuming, I feel is somewhat the spiritual heir to, or Elizabeth R. That's Elizabeth I in 2005, starring Helen Mirren as the Queen, and the costume designer was Mike O'Neill. Now, this was on HBO, and clearly did have a pretty big budget. While they didn't do gowns that were exact recreations, they did gowns that were sort of in the theme of different portraits. And what they focused on that I find really amazing was those surface treatments, similar in a way to Elizabeth R. And here, embroidery was again the star. There was an embroiderer who, fun fact, is the same embroiderer who later on did all the embroidery for HBO's Game of Thrones. Well, she kind of got her start as just an embroiderer. I mean, she had a lot of other work before, but doing specific embroidery. On this show, doing rich surface treatments for the gowns worn by Helen Mirren as Queen Elizabeth. And in the meantime, between sort of Elizabeth R. In the 1970s and Elizabeth I in 2005, there had been things like the Cate Blanchett Elizabeth movies, which had a more stripped down aesthetic for Elizabethan costume, which I feel really got away from something that is, in my mind, much more historically accurate and that you see in the portraits, which is that rich surface detail, jeweling, embroidery, rich, damasks that really feel of the period. And the stripped down aesthetic, that makes it always look a little too modern to me. So that's why I really appreciated Elizabeth I, and that they went and used a real, live embroiderer to get that feeling.
I like that they made a number of high-necked gowns, which you see a ton in the portraiture, and was very popular in the period, but is hardly ever reproduced on screen. And I feel like it's a very elegant, sophisticated look. And granted, they are doing mature Elizabeth here, so it suits her character maybe in a way that younger Elizabeth doesn't. But it's just refreshing to see. It looks great on Helen Mirren. And yeah, it's regal, it's elegant, it's sophisticated, and it makes me happy.
What I really liked, the intro credits on the first episode show Elizabeth being undressed by her ladies in waiting, and it takes you through all the layers. And so I really found that special about this, is that clearly, the design team understood that you got to have these layers because that's part of essentially Elizabeth's character. And without that, you're lacking a lot of the oomph that you would get without the bum roll, the pair of bodies, 3 different petticoats, the sleeves come off of the bodice. Like it just shows you how it goes together. So there's a lot of theatrical shortcuts that, knowledgeable people will be able to pick up. A lot of whopper poppers, I think, and hooks and eyes and whatnot. But it doesn't negate the fact that they really actually had the presence of mind to try to give this impression that the foundation layers are part of what makes the grand costume. And to see it all taken off is a really interesting opening scene.
And proof that people who value historical accuracy don't expect you to actually make clothes literally the way that they made them and wear them the way that they made them in order to appreciate it. You can use theatrical shortcuts and deal with reality and practicality, or not, as we will talk about in a second. But you can do that, and you can still keep the core of the period. And as I always say, you can't understand the people, the period, any of that if you don't understand their worldview, and part of their worldview is made up by what they're wearing.
Absolutely.
Ding, ding, ding.
Absolutely. The last production that we'll talk about with excellent costuming is Wolf Hall from 2015. And the costume designer was Joanna Eatwell, who's done a ton of BBC productions, and this was another BBC production. And this tells the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn from Thomas Cromwell's point of view. We podcasted about this one as well. We loved this when it came out. A lot of that was because of Mark Rylance's amazing performance. But also the costumes really made the entire thing work well together. One thing that I liked about it was actually not the fancy court costumes for a change, but it was the middling class kind of everyday costumes. Some of the first scenes, Cromwell's home with his wife, who soon dies, and his children, where they are wearing very simple kirtles. They have their caps, and the old daughters have their little caps. It's very simple. It's very accurate. It's like what you see of some Holbein sketches, and a lot of times the middling classes, they look sloppy, or they look dirty or filthy, or like, we're all in our unfortunate biggins and we're looking crappy, and but no, these were, well-to-do people. They were clean and tidy, and they would keep everything, and they're nice white linens, and everything's fitted and everything's proper, but it doesn't have to be flashy either. So that's refreshing. And also Thomas More's family, Alice More, I love her.
They recreated that portrait. They literally recreated that portrait, which is the best part, is the monkey's even there.
Exactly. Exactly. One thing that's great about her is that she is a woman of a little larger size. Her gown fits perfectly. It's nice and trim around her, and she has her nice hood that fits properly. She just looks elegant. It's so well done. These are out of a portrait too, just not the big flashy portraits that we often think of.
They look like real clothes. You can picture yourself living your life in these clothes.
So I'm going to jump actually to the upper class clothing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the costumes worn by Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn. And there were a lot of talk, the fact that the wrinkles on her bodices, there was a lot of discussion about this and whether or not it was historically accurate. I have a theory. They were using silk satin, so they were actually using like the appropriate type of fabric. But silk satin is notoriously difficult to get to lie smoothly across the front of the bodice. Ask me how, I know. So of course these wrinkles, these stress wrinkles would happen across it. And they were using the placket theory that there's a gown, the gown would lace like this, and then there would be a placket that would pin on over it. And so it's not tethered to anything. It's not stabilized on its own. It's essentially a piece of fabric with maybe a couple of layers of interlining, and it's pinned. And so of course that will just create wrinkles. That's kind of I'm an apologist for this particular thing. But one of the dresses that didn't have this problem that was worn by Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn is her yellow gown. And it's actually referencing a very famous incident that happened shortly before she gets crowned. Historically speaking, she was very well known for wearing this yellow gown to this particular party. And actually Henry preferred the color yellow. So it was this kind of nod to it. And it's a very beautiful gown, but one of the interesting things about it is the construction does not have the front wrinkling problem. And from what I can tell, it's because it's actually, I think, created all in one piece. The bodice is actually a one-piece bodice. It doesn't have that placket that pins in. And also another thing that helps in that is that it's, I think, taffeta. Don't quote me on that, because again, I can't handle the fabric. I'm just trying to go by what I can see, but I think it's taffeta, and taffeta is a lot more forgiving, more structured fabric than satin is. And so it's just a beautiful gown, and I'm a sucker for yellow on a brunette. So
there was also some interviews with the costume designer that mentioned that they had only a really, really brief window of time to fit lead actress Claire Foy, who plays Anne Boleyn. So they worked with the Globe Theatre, and then Jenny Tiramani, who I think used to be with the Globe and is now with the School of Historical Dress, on the period practice of wearing clothes. So one of the things that I love is many things are pinned together, and that's how you did it. You would pin or baste things together temporarily. It allows things to, be connected. Things like we were talking earlier about a bodice and skirt not being connected. A lot of those things would be sort of temporarily done, but they were done. Anyway, and you can see a lot of those elements in many of the costumes, including Jane Seymour's.
All right, so those are some of our least favorite and most favorite productions on screen with 16th century costume. Now, you may agree, you may disagree. We want to hear from you. You can comment. You can catch us on our blog, on Facebook, on Instagram, all those kind of places. And of course, as we mentioned, we have podcasts about several of these productions, and we have full reviews about them as well. So do check out our blog for plenty more about each of the productions we've mentioned. We are Frockflix. Frockflix.com. I'm Tristan. That's Sarah. That's Kendra. We're out.